In the Vienna of Brahms, Mahler, Strauss, Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, and Korngold, there was yet another composer at the center of musical life, one who these great names of music all knew well and deeply respected: Alexander Zemlinsky. Johannes Brahms offered the 25-year-old Zemlinsky a monthly grant so he could spend more time composing. The first string quartet takes us back to that time when Brahms first noticed the young Zemlinsky. In 1896, the Helmsberger Quartet performed Zemlinsky's string quartet in D minor, and Johannes Brahms pronounced, "It's bursting with talent." But Brahms was concerned with some modernist tendencies and summoned the 25-year-old Zemlinsky to a private conversation, which Zemlinsky described as follows, quote, "A conversation with Brahms was no easy matter. Question and answer were curt, gruff, seemingly cold, and often highly sarcastic. As I shyly attempted to defend a passage in the development section which seemed to me, in the Brahmsian sense, quite successful, he opened the score of a Mozart string quintet and demonstrated the perfection of its still unsurpassed formal design. And his concluding remark sounded perfectly objective and matter of course. Brahms said, 'That's the method handed down from Bach to myself.'" In the opening of the Opus 4 Quartet, Zemlinsky assimilates the metric ambiguities of Brahms's music, his shifting of rhythmic pulse and accent and phrasing, and yet it is already fresh and personal. Arnold Schoenberg married Zemlinsky's sister Matilda in 1901. A young painter named Richard Gerzel rented a studio in the same building in which the Schoenberg family lived and became a member of their circle of friends, accompanying the Schoenbergs on holidays. Schoenberg was also a talented painter, and he and Gerzel worked side by side, influencing each other's work. Matilda also studied painting with Gerzel, and soon she and the young painter began an affair and eloped. Schoenberg's marriage to Matilda was nearly destroyed, but Anton Webern convinced Matilda to return to her husband and children. Gerzel, then 25 years old, burned many of his paintings and notes, and then committed suicide by hanging himself. Schoenberg embarked upon a series of compositions that expressed his profound dejection. Zemlinsky's second string quartet is dedicated to Schoenberg and is a work of despair, turmoil, and emotional torment. Zemlinsky wrote to his former lover, Alma Schindler, who was by this time Alma Mahler, "Perhaps it will make a certain impression on you, particularly if you know which period in my life finds expression in it." The second quartet is an enormous work, Zemlinsky's grandest instrumental achievement. It is a furtive, cryptic chronicle of the Gerzel affair, told with musical ciphers and symbols. Inspired by Brahms's use of ciphers and symbols and secret codes in music, Zemlinsky wanted to do the same thing. Joachim and Brahms were famous for their motifs frei aber froh, which was free but happy, or frei aber einsam, free but lonely. So Zemlinsky developed the motif of the self, which were these three notes. But for him, it didn't have to be those particular notes, just those intervals. Those three notes represent the self. And to represent his sister Matilda, he took those three notes, transposed them here, and added one note. This gives him the name Matilda because the A in Ma and the B comes from the German letter H. That stands for B in German. So the M-A-T-H, and then the final syllable of Matilda in German is D-E. There are the notes of her name. He also has a very important code for the word fate. It's a simple chord, D minor plus a G sharp. And it occurs very close to the beginning of the piece. And it occurs in very important places throughout the work. At one point, there's a very quiet passage interrupted by the chord of fate. There's another aspect to the codes and ciphers, but you can't hear this one. He wrote to Schoenberg that the piece would be in F sharp minor, but it's not. It's in D major and D minor, primarily D minor, which is the chord of fate. He actually said it's pretending to be in F sharp minor. Well, what did he mean? The beginning of the piece is actually notated in F sharp minor, even though it doesn't stay there. And that's because F sharp minor has 3 sharps, which in German is Kreuz, which is the same as the word for cross. So these 3 sharps on the page, referring back to Bach, represent Golgotha. It represents agony, grief, suffering, and hoped for forgiveness. The music of Zemlinsky's third quartet also reflected real-life events, in particular the death of his sister Matilda in October 1923, and also Schoenberg's second marriage, which occurred before the customary year of mourning. Shortly after Matilda's death, Schoenberg wrote an extensive poem called Requiem, which he intended to set to music as a tribute to Matilda, but he never wrote the work. Just before his 50th birthday, Schoenberg married Gertrude Kolisch, the sister of his student, the violinist Rudolf Kolisch, founder of the Kolisch Quartet. That his second marriage was again to the sister of a loyal musical colleague may have struck Zemlinsky as an act of substitution. Zemlinsky's third quartet may be understood as a lament for his sister, the promised requiem that Schoenberg never wrote. In fact, Zemlinsky began to compose this quartet on the day Schoenberg announced his marriage to Gertrude Kolisch. Determined to liberate himself from Schoenberg's overshadowing musical influence and perhaps his authority in general, Zemlinsky was inspired by new aesthetics he encountered at the 1924 International Society for Contemporary Music Festival held in Prague. There he heard works by Stravinsky, Honegger, Prokofiev, Malapiero, Roussel, Florence Schmidt, and others. As strong as these influences were, the emotional power of the work flows from his grief over Matilda's death. The first theme that you hear in this quartet is a quote of his own lyric symphony. What Zemlinsky quotes in this quartet comes from his lyric symphony, and it's sung by a soprano. It sounds like this. The words that she sings are, "Forget this night when there is no night," an obvious reference to the Gerzel affair. This is a secret message for those who know that piece. And yet the motto that represents his sister Matilda is deliberately missing from the entire piece because this is a requiem for her death. So for those who expected it, like Schoenberg, they would know that it was missing, and it shows the significance of the ciphers and the codes for Zemlinsky, but ironically, by omission. The second movement is another kind of commentary on Schoenberg, but now it is not personal. It is purely aesthetic. In 1923, Schoenberg called his students together in his home to introduce them to a piano work composed with his newly developed 12-tone method. Zemlinsky had not followed Schoenberg into the atonal forest, but preferred to push the limits of tonality without abandoning it completely. He used delayed resolutions of intense dissonances, allowing for, as Korngold described it, freedom and audacity. But now Schoenberg had demonstrated a new comprehensive compositional technique, and Zemlinsky derisively mocks the new aesthetic in his theme and variations movement of the third quartet. Zemlinsky remained a close friend of Alban Berg after his contact with Schoenberg and Webern had ended. When Zemlinsky heard that Berg had suddenly died at the age of 50, he canceled all his conducting engagements and stopped working on his eighth opera to compose a memorial to Berg, which is the fourth string quartet. The Polish quartet, with Schoenberg's new brother-in-law, gave a private reading of this work, since the Nazis had banned Zemlinsky's music. In the manuscript, Zemlinsky wrote the subtitle Suite, a reference to Berg's lyric suite, the remarkable string quartet, which Berg dedicated to Zemlinsky, and in which he quotes Zemlinsky's lyric symphony. Thus we have, in the second quartet, a secret diary of familial tragedy. The third quartet, a requiem to his sister Matilda, and the fourth quartet, a requiem to his close friend, Alban Berg. The quartet opens with a mournful preludium with the self motif and introduces the Matilda motto. But in the second movement, there is an eruption of feverish energy. It rages. The music does not go gentle into that good night. Berg died suddenly and young, and the rage Zemlinsky felt pours out of him in this movement, titled Burlesque. For the theme and variations in the fourth quartet, Zemlinsky wrote a searching recitative that nearly becomes an aria for solo cello. The theme is an uneasy elegy for his departed friend Alban Berg. The first variation passes the soulful melody to the first violin, while the other three instruments weave a richly contrapuntal fabric of distinctly individual threads. It's a texture that conveys intense emotion, recalling Zemlinsky's early fascination with Brahms. But here, it is a fully mature, original manifestation of that yearning romanticism. It is a sound world allied to Berg's music, but it is fully Zemlinsky's own, as authentic, as deeply felt as his grief.